The queue outside the requisitioned barn did not look like a rear area. It looked like a front line that had been turned sideways. Mud and crushed leaves from the hedgerows had dried into a pale crust on boots and trouser hems. Sweat darkened collars. Men stood too close because there was nowhere else to stand, packed between wire panels and sawhorses that forced them into a single file. Inside the barn, a generator thumped, and every so often a gust carried out the sharp bite of disinfectant and a chalky dust that settled on skin. Hans Braun had been a radio maintenance man, trained to keep wires dry and contacts clean, but the last weeks had been all moisture and grit. The Americans had taken him 2 mornings earlier in a field churned by shell holes, and since then his world had been a road, a guard, and the itch that kept crawling under seams. He could feel it now, a faint movement along his waistband. He kept his hands still. Scratching made the guards look closer. At the first gate, an MP checked him quickly, hands patting pockets and waistband with practiced speed. The search was not a performance. It was the same motion repeated on every prisoner, a routine that made no room for insults or curiosity. Beyond the gate, a second MP directed him toward a table under a tarp where a clerk worked beside an interpreter. Forms lay in neat stacks. String-tied envelopes waited in rows. Nothing moved without a mark. The interpreter spoke in German and pointed at a dented metal tray. Hans emptied his pockets. A pencil stub, a strip of wire he had kept from a field repair, a folded slip of paper with radio frequencies that mattered to no one now. Each item landed with a small clink. The clerk did not look up. He wrote, checked a box, and slid the tray down the line to the next pair of hands. Hans hesitated when his fingers found the toothbrush. It was worn and ugly, bristles bent from months of hard water, but it was the last thing he had that still belonged to an ordinary routine. When he held it, he could remember mornings before the war when the day began with small, controllable steps. He did not need to think about courage or ideology to feel the tug of it. He only needed to imagine losing even that. The MP at the table extended a hand, palm up, without impatience. The interpreter relayed that the toothbrush had to be inspected and categorized before Hans could pass. Hygiene items could be retained under certain conditions. Other items would be sealed and tracked. Hans stared at the envelopes and the stamp pad and understood that the Americans were building a chain he could not see through. He kept the toothbrush closed in his fist. The pause rippled down the line. Men behind him shifted. A few American soldiers on the fence line leaned in, drawn by the sudden halt and the chance to watch something go wrong. Heat and attention pooled on Hans like a weight. The clerk finally looked up, eyes moving from Hans' knuckles to the tray. He said something to the interpreter, who told Hans that refusal would remove him from sequence and delay his processing. Delay would mean isolation until compliance. Hans did not answer. He had learned that words invited arguments, and arguments were a kind of defeat. He tried to wait out the moment, as if time itself could make the demand soften. The MP kept his hand out, still and empty. The onlookers murmured. Someone laughed. A compact sergeant stepped into the lane, helmet strap tight under his jaw. His armband marked him as military police, and his posture said he was in charge of the flow. Sergeant Gus Hanley did not ask for a story. He looked at Hans Fist, then at the table, then at the fence line where the soldiers had edged closer. He made a short hand signal that pulled 2 MPs into position, one at the lane and one at Hans' shoulder. The interpreter spoke again, sharper, explaining that the procedure was mandatory and that refusal would trigger separation for review. Hans felt the shift before anyone touched him. The line behind him stopped being a crowd and became a push. The guard at his shoulder did not strike. He simply placed a forearm across Hans' path, an unspoken barrier that made the next step Impossible. Hanley pointed to a small side pen of wire and posts, a holding area no wider than a truck bed. The interpreter told Hans to step aside. Hans hesitated, and the forearm hardened. The lane moved again around him as the MPs redirected traffic. He took 2 steps into the pen because the alternative was to be forced, and forced movement would mean losing the last illusion of control he had. The main line resumed at once, as if the system had relieved itself of a blockage. A few onlookers lost interest when there was no struggle to watch. Inside the pen, 2 MPs angled their bodies to cover the exits. One watched Hans' hands. One watched the lane. Hanley stood at the wire opening with a form pressed against the fence, writing with a thick pencil. The interpreter relayed that a refusal was being recorded along with the item in question. Hans watched the pencil move. He did not know the words, but he recognized the logic. He was no longer just a man waiting in line. He was a case. Hanley finished the entry and passed the form back to the clerk, who clipped it beneath a board and added a number in the margin. Then Hanley turned and made a quick, decisive gesture at the fence line, pushing the curious soldiers back from the lane. A man took one last look and stepped away. The space around the pen felt less exposed, not private, but bounded. The interpreter told Hans that a compliance review would follow and that the toothbrush would be assessed for retention or sealing. Until then, Hans would remain separated and would not enter the canvas partitions inside the barn. Hans stared at the fluttering edge of canvas beyond the doors and listened to the hiss and rattle within. Men were moving through that machine and emerging, changed, cleaned, numbered, routed onward. He was paused in front of it. He loosened his fingers just enough to see the toothbrush handle again. It looked smaller than it had a minute earlier. His palm was slick with sweat. He realized, with a calm that felt like cold water, that the Americans had not needed to shout to take command of his options. They had only needed to write. The wire pen baked in the afternoon heat. Each draft that lifted the barn canvas carried disinfectant and sweat, and with it the reminder that the line inside was moving without him. Hans kept his hands on the mesh, fingers locked, refusing to scratch at the sting under his waistband because every small motion drew eyes. Gus Hanley returned from the barn with a clipboard and a runner at his shoulder. The runner spoke fast, pointing back through the doors. The interpreter followed and then relayed in German that the delousing station had hit a shortage. Hot water was faltering, powder was running thin. The procedure had to compress, or it would stop entirely. The change showed at once. The main file tightened until shoulders touched. Men who had advanced in steady steps now stalled and shifted in place, sweating through collars that were already damp. An MP carried out a metal bucket with chalky residue clinging to the bottom, shook it once to show there was nothing left, then turned it upside down in a gesture that needed no translation. Shortage also drew spectators. A knot of American infantry drifted toward the lane, bored, irritated, looking for something to justify their waiting. Hanley saw it and moved the boundary before it became an event. He dragged a sawhorse closer, narrowed the passage, and used broad arm sweeps to push the onlookers back to the fence line. The lane became a corridor again, not a stage. One young private ignored the reset. He edged forward anyway, helmet liner new, face too smooth for a long war, and leaned toward the sorting table with a grin that asked for a reaction. His fingers hovered over the dented tray as if the prisoner's belongings were souvenirs. Hans felt the heat rise into his face. The private wanted the moment where the enemy flinched, where the crowd could laugh. Hans kept his posture rigid and his eyes forward. He would not give the man a signal to feed on. Hanley cut across the lane and placed himself between the private and the table. He did not argue. He tapped the private once on the chest to establish distance, then pointed to the boundary, then to the gate. An MP at the post stepped in, and the private was forced into a hard choice between complying or making the incident official. Hanley made it official anyway, He turned to his clipboard and wrote a short entry while the private stood at attention near the sawhorse. The act of writing changed the tone. The cluster by the fence line quieted when they saw paper and pencil, the kind of consequence that followed a man beyond a single afternoon. Hanley tore the slip and handed it to the post MP, who redirected the private away toward a work detail near the trucks. The performance ended, the boundary held. Hanley then faced Hans at the pen opening. The interpreter repeated the rule. The toothbrush had to be presented for inspection and classification before Hans could enter the delousing line. If he refused, he would remain isolated and delayed, and delay meant missing the window for medical screening and transfer. Hans looked toward the barn doors. The delay had already erased his leverage. The system had not softened. It had routed around him. He loosened his fist and raised the toothbrush toward the mesh. Bristles turned inward, as if he could keep it from the eyes around him. An MP took it with 2 fingers and inspected it quickly, checking the handle and the bristles for anything that did not belong. He set it on the tray and slid it to the clerk. The clerk wrote without expression, and the interpreter began the next set of intake questions in clipped German: name, age, specialty. Hans answered with the tight economy of a man who had learned that extra detail could be punished. He said he maintained radios and repaired field lines, that he kept communication equipment working, nothing more. He avoided any language that sounded like secrets. He wanted the toothbrush categorized as a hygiene item and the process finished. The interpreter translated. The clerk nodded and then, under pressure from the jammed line, marked the wrong box. Hanley saw it. He leaned over the table, finger tapping the entry once, then looked at the interpreter. The interpreter asked Hans to repeat his role. Hans repeated it, sharper, insisting on the same plain description. The interpreter translated again, slower, and Hanley stopped the clerk with a flat palm. The flow paused. The clerk frowned, erased the mark, and rewrote it. In the margin he added a second notation, a verification flag that changed Hans's route, even as it corrected the record. Shortage had tightened the station, and tight stations did not allow ambiguous paperwork to pass forward. The interpreter explained the immediate consequence. Because the initial classification had been entered and corrected, protocol required a separate review before Hans could be cleared into the main sequence. He would be held for verification. He would not rejoin the line yet. The words were neutral. The result was not. Hanley opened the pen and directed Hans out not toward the main file but along a side corridor, screened by canvas and another sawhorse. The screen did not fully close, but it broke the direct view from the fence line. The act was small and deliberate, a boundary inside the boundary. A second table waited under the screen with a different stack of forms. An MP placed the toothbrush into a string-tied envelope but did not seal it. He wrote a number on the flap and set it in a shallow wooden tray, labeled for pending review, flaps lifted slightly, numbers visible, none closed. Hans watched the envelope settle among others and felt the loss in a way his body understood. The toothbrush was inside the system now and outside his hand. Hanley signed the edge of Hans's form, pointed at the corrected entry and the verification flag, and handed it to the review clerk. His gestures made it plain that this was procedure, not preference. The marks dictated the next step. Hans was placed on a bench with his feet behind a painted line. His hands remained in sight. The MPs assigned to him stood at angles that blocked sudden movement without crowding him. The generator thumped. Inside the barn, the delousing line resumed in uneven bursts, stopping whenever water faltered and powder ran thin. Hans stared at the tray until the numbers blurred. He had tried to protect himself with refusal, then with explanation, and both had narrowed his options. Control had moved from his grip to ink. and ink did not care how tightly he had once held a handle. The review bench sat beneath a canvas lip that offered shade without relief. The air stayed wet and thick, and the itch under Hans's waistband made every second feel longer. He kept both hands on his knees and his boots behind the painted line because the MPs watched that line the way they watched hands. His verification flag had separated him from the main delousing lane, and separation meant time. Time meant missed windows. On the table in front of him, the pending tray lay open. String-tied envelopes rested in a single layer with numbers written on the flaps. A clerk worked the register with a dull pencil, checking each number against each flap. Under normal flow, the tray would be cleared in minutes. Under shortage and crowding, verification turned into its own bottleneck, a place where pressure collected and mistakes surfaced. An MP called the sequence in a low voice. The clerk tracked it, finger sliding down the page. When the call ended, the clerk paused and tapped the register once, then tapped the tray. The counts did not agree. A number sat on the paper with no envelope to carry it. Another envelope sat on the wood with no matching line. The mismatch changed the whole station. The sealing box on the next table could not be used, which meant the transfer stack could not be built, which meant the review corridor could not empty, which meant the main lane would tighten again outside the barn. Men in the queue began to shift and murmur. A few American soldiers on the fence line noticed the stall and drifted closer, irritation and curiosity mixing in their faces. Gus Hanley stepped into the pocket and stopped the next prisoner group with a flat hand held at shoulder height. The corridor went still. He sent one MP to widen the sawhorse boundary and push the fence line back, turning the corridor into a narrow channel again. Hanley did not ask for guesses. He looked at the register, then at the tray, then at the sealing box. He placed 2 fingers on the tray edge, blocking the clerk from sliding envelopes around to make the problem disappear. The interpreter moved close enough for Hans to hear. The instruction in German was brief. Hans was to remain seated and still. The tray issue did not involve him unless he made it involve him, and if he made it involve him, he would lose any claim that his delay was procedural rather than personal. Heat pressed through the canvas. From inside the barn came the scrape of boots, and the hiss of water turned lukewarm. The main line was trying to keep moving, and that pressure reached the review table in the clerk's hurried breathing and the way his pencil dug too hard into paper. The clerk pointed at an envelope number close to Hans's and spoke quickly, proposing a fast correction. He wanted to swap 2 labels and let the box be sealed. Hanley refused it with one sharp gesture. He tapped the original register entry and then pointed back toward the first sorting table. He wanted the chain traced, not patched. 2 MPs walked back along the side corridor to the sorting point where items first entered envelopes. They checked pencil marks on the table edge, then the stack of unused flaps, then the small dish reserved for loose items when paper tore or string snapped. One MP returned holding a torn envelope corner with a smeared number and a bit of string still knotted through the paper. The clerk compared the smear to the missing entry. He turned it under the light and nodded. The missing number had not vanished. It had ripped away and been carried forward in scraps, unlogged, waiting for someone to notice. The mistake was not malicious. It was friction, the kind that happened when hands moved too fast in heat and disinfectant. Hanley pointed at the loose item dish and signaled it forward. The MP brought it to the table. Inside were 3 small objects and a string loop. Hans saw his toothbrush among them, bristles bent, handle damp where it had been set down in haste. His chest tightened. The toothbrush was not lost. It was close enough to touch, and the closeness made it harder to sit still. The interpreter warned him again. He was not to reach. The warning carried a second detail. If Hans forced a disturbance, he would be moved to full isolation and would miss the next medical screening slot, delaying transfer beyond nightfall. Hans heard the words and felt the trap. Compliance meant waiting while the object lay exposed. Interference meant losing the timetable entirely. His body decided before his mind finished choosing. Hans leaned forward, and his boot toe slid over the painted line. His hand lifted half an inch, not yet a grab, but enough to signal intent. The nearest MP moved instantly, pushing Hans back onto the bench with a firm palm to the shoulder. Another stepped between Hans and the table, stance wide, filling the space. A third MP shifted to cover the corridor opening. The action was controlled and quick, but it changed the room. Hans's attempt made him a risk again, and risk triggered visible boundaries. Hanley issued a short order and pointed to a post marker beside the bench. The MPs shifted Hans to the marked spot. A strap looped around the post and across his forearms, not tight enough to bruise, tight enough to end the possibility of sudden motion. The interpreter relayed the consequence in German. Any further interference would trigger full isolation and a new intake time, and the notation would travel with his paperwork. Hans stared at the strap and the dish. He had reached for a toothbrush and earned restraints. The logic was clean and brutal, the kind of clarity he had once respected in wiring diagrams. Cross a line and the circuit closes. Hanley treated the attempted reach as proof that the boundary had to be enforced, not as license for humiliation. He directed the clerk to open a fresh envelope, write the missing number cleanly, and list the loose objects one by one on the correct register line. The clerk complied. He set the toothbrush into the envelope with deliberate care, then folded the flap and tightened the string. Hanley signed beside the corrected entry. An MP signed as witness. The register now matched the physical tray. The correction was slow, but it was real, and it created a path for the next handoff that did not depend on memory or mood. Hans watched the envelope join the others. The toothbrush disappeared again, this time inside a number that could be followed. The corridor reopened. The next group was waved forward. Hans remained strapped to the post, waiting for the system to decide when his hands would be allowed to move and whether his delay would remain a matter of procedure or become a permanent label. The strap at the post marker held Hans in place with a steadiness that felt worse than force. It was not pain. It was the certainty that his choices had narrowed to almost nothing. Across the review table, the corrected register lay open, and the clerk moved through it with a cautious rhythm, calling numbers, matching flaps, and taking signatures before each envelope went into the transfer crate. Outside the corridor, the main lane scraped and stalled whenever the hot water sputtered. Each stall drew men at the fence line closer, irritated by delay and hungry to watch something happen to someone else. Hans felt their attention settle on him, on the strap, on the fact that he had become a visible exception. He kept his gaze on the transfer crate and tried to treat the envelope that held his toothbrush as only one object among many. The effort did not work. Gus Hanley saw the fence line tightening and moved without raising his voice. He dragged two sawhorses forward, ordered an MP to stretch canvas between them, and turned the review corridor into a screened channel. The soldiers lost their view in a single motion and drifted back. The corridor became procedure again, not theater. Hanley returned to the table and placed his fingertip on Hans' register line. The clerk pointed to the faint smear where the first sorting table had erased and rewritten a category box. It was corrected, but the ghost mark remained. Under pressure, a ghost mark could become a reason for extra custody and extra delay. Hanley asked for the original intake board. An MP jogged back and returned with the clip sheet, edges curled from sweat. Hanley compared it to the review register and signaled the interpreter in close. The interpreter asked Hans to restate his duty slowly. Hans forced his breathing down and answered in plain words. He serviced radios and repaired field lines. He carried no special authority. He did not offer detail that could be twisted. He kept his voice level because any sign of pleading would look like guilt. The interpreter translated with the same plainness. Hanley watched the clerk and stopped his pencil twice with a flat palm, making him wait for the translation to finish. Then Hanley had the clerk read back the entry while the interpreter confirmed the meaning. The record became a closed loop instead of a hurried guess. A second clerk arrived with a stamp pad and a set of category cards. Shortage had reduced tolerance for ambiguity, and the station had tightened what could be tightened. Hanley pointed to the toothbrush envelope number and then to the card for minimal hygiene retention, category that allowed a small personal item to remain associated with a prisoner through transfer if it was inspected, numbered, and tracked. The envelope was brought forward. Hanley did not open it in the open corridor. He made a short gesture, and an MP pulled a heavier canvas curtain from a hook and slid it across the corridor mouth until the review table was fully screened from the fence line and the main lane. Hans watched the MP pull the curtain and realized the toothbrush was the last line between a man and a spectacle. Behind the curtain, the air felt less exposed. Hanley ordered the strap loosened enough for Hans to flex his fingers without reaching the table. The interpreter relayed the condition. Cooperation would return Hans to the delousing and medical sequence immediately, and interference would send him to full isolation and a new intake slot. Hanley opened the envelope at the table edge and inspected the toothbrush again. The action was not suspicion, it was closure. The chain had been disrupted once, and the rule required it be reclosed under witness. The clerk listed the toothbrush on the retention line, stamped the category box, and wrote the return point on the form, after the medical check at the transfer desk against the register number. Hanley signed beside the stamp. A witness MP signed beneath. The record now dictated the return. The interpreter explained the next constraint. The toothbrush could not stay in Hans' hand through the wash line. Objects could not cross the partitions, but the envelope would travel in a lidded box with other retained items, locked to Hans' paperwork by number. At the transfer desk, the receiving MP would match the envelope number to the register and require Hans' acknowledgement mark before handing it back. Hans felt his grip on the problem loosen. He had been protecting the toothbrush because it was the only thing he could protect. Now it was protected by marks that could be checked. That did not make the Americans gentle. It made them consistent, and consistency changed his options more than any promise could. Hanley ordered the strap removed. The MPs unhooked it without drama. Hans stood with red wrists and kept his hands at his sides. The interpreter instructed him to follow hand signals without delay. An MP carried the envelope in a small metal box with a latch and a painted number. The lid closed with a click that sounded final. Hanley stepped aside to clear the lane, and Hans moved into the barn partitions when the MP pointed. The delousing line ran in uneven bursts. Men moved through canvas bays under supervision, clothing rooted to fumigation racks, bodies rinsed and dusted in measured motions. Each boundary was guarded by posture and hand signals rather than threats. Hans complied. Hands up for inspection. Step forward, turn, wait. Each movement produced an immediate consequence. Compliance kept him in sequence. Any pause would trigger separation again. At the medical check station, a corpsman glanced at the verification flag and then at Hanley's signature beside the corrected entry. One confirming question went to the interpreter. The interpreter answered. The corpsman marked the form cleanly and waved Hans onward. The flag did not vanish, but it stopped pulling him out of line. It had been converted into a documented resolution. At the transfer desk, under a separate canvas bay, a different MP opened the retained items box. He compared the envelope number to the register line and held the envelope up for Hans to see before handing it over. The interpreter instructed Hans to touch the number and then make his mark on the receipt line. Hans did it. The MP handed him the toothbrush handle first, as if it were ordinary issue, not a prize. Hans closed his fingers around it and felt the object as weight and texture, no longer as a fuse. The lane ahead was still captivity. The difference was that the boundary between him and the crowd had been drawn, signed, and enforced, and that boundary changed what he could do next. After the transfer desk, the lane opened into a fenced holding yard where chalk lines divided the ground into waiting blocks. The sun had started to tilt, but the air stayed heavy, trapped in the same damp heat that had fed the itch and the impatience all day. Men sat where they were directed, boots behind the lines, hands visible. A water can and a dented cup sat on a crate with a guard posted beside it, not to withhold water, but to keep the yard from turning into a crush. Hans took the nearest bench and sat with his paperwork folded in his left hand. The toothbrush rested in his right, handle down, bristles up, not as a trophy and not as a secret. He had carried it out of the review corridor as a numbered obligation. The difference showed in what he did not do. He did not close his fist until his knuckles whitened. He did not scan for faces along the wire. He waited, because waiting was now the shortest path forward. At the gate, an MP checked each prisoner against a clipboard list. He paused when he reached Hans, tracing the verification flag and then the closing signature beside the corrected entry. The MP did not ask for an explanation. He looked for the stamp and found it. The gate swung open and Hans was waved into the yard. The paperwork had already absorbed the conflict, leaving only a route. A corporal moved down the benches with a new stack of forms, breaking the yard into transfer groups. He stopped at Hans, glanced at the toothbrush, and made a small questioning gesture. Hans pointed to the hygiene retention stamp on his form and to the envelope number written in the margin. The corporal compared the number to the line, nodded once, and moved on. There was no argument to win. There was only a match to confirm. Near the trucks, Gus Hanley worked at a folding table set against a tailgate. A shaded lamp was clipped to the truck frame, ready for evening intake. Hanley was writing again, not intake boxes, but incident entries, the fence line pressure, the private who had crossed the boundary, the corrective order that removed him, and the reason the curtain had been pulled. Each line ended with a time mark and a witness name. A second sergeant checked the sheet and countersigned, turning the actions into record rather than rumor. The private stood at attention beside the table with an MP at his shoulder. Hanley read the charge in a flat, procedural cadence and handed the paper to the escort. The private was walked away toward a work detail on the camp road. No one laughed, no one performed. The same system that tracked a toothbrush also tracked a soldier, and the yard stayed quiet because everyone could see it. A whistle cut through the heat. The corporal called the next transfer group and pointed to the trucks. Hans was directed into a group of 8. An MP checked wrist tags, checked stamps, and counted heads. The men climbed into the truck bed. Hans sat near the tailgate, keeping the toothbrush visible and his papers dry under his elbow. The truck rolled forward in a lurch, and the holding yard slid away behind them. The road ran between hedgerows and shattered farm walls. It was not far, but the movement felt different from the earlier march. The truck stopped at 2 checkpoints where MPs compared the transfer list to the forms. At the second stop, a guard made a short cutting motion toward Hans's visible item. Hans offered the toothbrush without hesitation. The guard inspected it, found the matching stamp, and returned it. The inspection was quick because the rule had been written to make it quick. By late evening, the truck reached a larger compound behind a line of trees. Floodlights washed the wire in hard white light. The intake tent had a signboard with rules printed in German and English in block letters, posted high enough that no one could claim not to have seen them. An MP with a clipboard directed the group to a table where a clerk verified delousing completion, medical check marks, and transfer receipts. Hans placed his papers down and waited while the clerk traced the stamps. The clerk's fingertip paused at the verification flag, then moved to Hanley's closing signature and the witness initials. The pause ended there. The clerk pointed to a bunk number in a hut row and wrote it on Hans's form. The system did not erase the earlier friction. It contained it. A guard led the group into a long hut with cots and a single aisle down the center. Bedding was basic: a thin mattress, a folded blanket, a footlocker. At the far end of the aisle, a basin and water can sat beneath a posted schedule. Hygiene time was listed as a fixed window under supervision. Personal items were permitted only if recorded, and they remained subject to inspection. Hans set his papers in the footlocker and sat on the cot. Men around him moved with the careful restraint of those who had learned that small infractions created large delays. A guard walked the aisle once, scanning hands and footlockers. He stopped at hands and gestured from the toothbrush to the schedule. The meaning was direct. Use it during the window. Keep it visible the rest of the time. Hans nodded and placed the toothbrush on top of the footlocker, not hidden, not clenched in a fist. When the window opened, he walked with the others to the basin and brushed his teeth with water that tasted of metal. The action was ordinary, and it changed him more than he expected. He was doing it because a stamp allowed it, because a curtain had blocked the crowd, because an order had removed a soldier who wanted a spectacle, and because signatures had turned a mistake into a corrected line. When he returned to his cot, he did not look toward the wire. The floodlights stayed outside. Inside the hut, the routine held. Head count, lights dimmed, guards posted at the aisle ends. Hans lay back with his arms at his sides. Captivity had not softened, but it had a shape he could read. The toothbrush sat on the footlocker within the boundaries that had been drawn and enforced, and the boundary itself was the thing he carried forward.